I stood frozen in the living room, my breaths coming in quick gasps, my heart pounding so hard that it felt like the entire world around me was shrinking. The dim glow from the table lamp cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the atmosphere heavier, almost suffocating. In front of me stood Mason, David's son, David, my devoted husband. His sharp eyes were locked onto mine, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, as if he was trying to restrain something threatening to break loose. This moment was nothing like anything I had ever prepared for. Everything had gone too far. Just minutes ago I had been sitting on the sofa, a glass of red wine by my side, savoring the rare tranquility of an evening without David at home. The house was unusually quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. I hadn't expected anyone. But then, the front door suddenly opened, and there he was. Mason, stepping into the house unannounced. At first I thought I was imagining it, but no, it was him, appearing without warning. Mason. I called his name, my voice breaking, barely audible. He didn't respond immediately. He stood there, tall and imposing in the muted light, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I could sense the turmoil in his eyes, something far more complicated than mere surprise. It was deeper, harder to define. I didn't expect you to be back, I stammered, trying to gather myself. Just came to grab something, he replied shortly, but his tone carried an undeniable hesitation. I didn't know you were here. We stood across from each other, the silence between us thick and almost suffocating. My throat felt tight, as if any words I tried to utter would shatter the fragile barrier we both seemed desperate to maintain. Mason took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. But there was something different in his gaze, not just curiosity, but a raw, unspoken intensity that I couldn't name. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft but layered with unspoken meaning. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I was telling the truth. Yeah, just surprised to see you. Mason moved a little closer, close enough for me to feel the faint warmth of his breath, and I knew in that moment I needed to leave the room. But my legs felt as though they were rooted to the floor, unable to move. I wondered if he felt it too, the tension crackling in the air, or if it was just in my head. He bent down to pick up the scarf I had accidentally dropped. When he handed it back to me, our fingers brushed. It was only a fleeting touch, but it ignited something within me, something I wasn't prepared for. I pulled my hand back quickly, my heart pounding so loudly that I was certain he could hear it. Sorry, Mason murmured, his voice low, but his gaze didn't waver. It's fine, I replied quickly, almost cutting him off, hoping the tremor in my voice wasn't too obvious. And then, he said nothing more. But his eyes lingered, heavy with meaning, as though he was trying to communicate something we both understood, but neither dared to acknowledge. I felt trapped in that moment, unable to escape the pull of his gaze. There was something about it, something magnetic, dangerous. It made me want to flee, yet it also made me want to stay. Finally, Mason stepped back, putting a little distance between us. I'll leave now, he said, but his voice lacked the certainty his words implied. Okay, I replied, but as the word left my lips, I realized I didn't want him to go. I couldn't explain why, but a part of me wanted to stretch this moment, to hold on to something I couldn't even define. When Mason walked out the door, the room fell into a silence so profound I could hear the pounding of my own heart. I sank into the sofa, unsure of how to process the storm of emotions raging inside me. It wasn't just confusion or fear. There was something else, something intense, something perilous that I dared not touch. I knew in that fleeting moment, everything had shifted. I couldn't go back to the way things were before. I sat on the sofa, the glass of wine on the table still untouched, and the soft glow of the table lamp cast a falsely warm ambience across the room. My mind began to drift back into the past, searching for explanations for the chaotic emotions I was struggling to control. How had I ended up in this situation? Had it all begun to change long before, and I just failed to notice? I vividly remembered the first time I met Mason, when David introduced him as an integral part of his life. "This is Mason, my son," David had said with unmistakable pride in his voice. I stood there, wearing a polite smile, but deep inside, I felt a pang of awkwardness. Being a stepmother was not something I had ever envisioned for myself, and the small age gap between Mason and me made everything even more uncomfortable. Mason was only a few years younger than me, which blurred the lines of my role in the family, a strange mix of familiarity and detachment. At that time, Mason was still a young man struggling to find his path. After graduating from college, he had difficulty securing a stable career, and when things seemed to hit a dead end, David had suggested he move in with us to save on expenses and regain his footing. I agreed, thinking it would be good for both father and son, but I never anticipated how Mason's presence would alter the entire dynamic of our home. In the beginning, my relationship with Mason was nothing noteworthy. He was quiet, spending most of his time in his room or out of the house. I tried to maintain the role of a cordial stepmother, but there remained a barrier between us, a wall neither of us seemed inclined to break down. However, things began to shift as Mason gradually opened up, and I realized he wasn't who I thought he was. I started to see Mason as more than a young man stumbling through life. He was thoughtful, deeply reflective, and someone who truly listened. Our conversations, which had initially revolved around mundane household matters, slowly became more personal. I found myself sharing dreams I had given up on, feelings of emptiness I couldn't express to anyone else, not even David. Mason never judged, he simply listened, his eyes filled with understanding as if he genuinely cared about what I was feeling. David, my husband, was a good man, kind and devoted, but he was always consumed by work. His frequent business trips and late nights at the office had created a void in our marriage, one I didn't know how to fill. I kept telling myself that it was normal, that David was doing what was best for our family. Yet the loneliness crept in, eroding the joy in my life piece by piece. Mason's presence, though unintentional, became a light in those monotonous days. He always seemed to show up at the right moments, offering a casual joke or unexpected help with something around the house. I began to look forward to those brief moments, whether it was a quick chat in the kitchen or a quiet sit-together on the back porch. One time, I vividly remembered, Mason helped me fix an old rocking chair that had once belonged to my mother, a sentimental keepsake I'd kept but never used. As he crouched down to inspect the worn-out joints, his eyes lit up as if he was genuinely enjoying the task. "This piece means a lot to you, doesn't it?" he asked, and when I nodded, he smiled with such understanding that it left me momentarily speechless. It was the first time I realized that alongside the loneliness, there was a warmth that blossomed whenever Mason was near. Still, I never allowed myself to act on those feelings. I constantly reminded myself that Mason was David's son, and I was David's wife. Whatever I felt was merely a fleeting misinterpretation born out of isolation. But the truth was, Mason's presence awakened a part of me I thought had long been lost, a part that felt seen, understood, and acknowledged as a person, not just as a wife fulfilling her role. These memories, these seemingly insignificant moments, now swirled inside me like a storm I couldn't escape. I didn't know how to face Mason, but I also didn't know how to stop thinking about him. As I sat there in the stillness of the living room, the echoes of the past replayed in my mind, dragging me deeper into a whirlwind of emotions with no way out. The days following that last encounter, I tried desperately to return to my normal life. I told myself that my feelings for Mason were nothing more than a fleeting infatuation, a momentary lapse brought on by loneliness. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His deep, piercing eyes, the fleeting but genuine smiles, and the way he made me feel like a real woman again, not just a forgotten wife. Mason didn't intentionally seek me out after that night. He continued with his usual tasks around the house, but he maintained a careful distance. Yet, it was that very distance that unsettled me even more. I could feel his eyes on me at times, a quick glance, fleeting but loaded with emotions neither of us dared to acknowledge. It was as if we were both trying to keep a secret that could no longer be contained. One afternoon, while David was away on another long business trip, I found myself alone in the house with Mason. He was working in the backyard, fixing an old swing that David had once promised to repair but had since forgotten. From the window, I could see him hunched over with a wrench in his hand, his strong frame standing out against the warm sunlight. I couldn't help but feel a strange warmth rise within me as I watched him. But that warmth was accompanied by fear, the fear that I was crossing a line I had no business approaching. I decided to step outside with a glass of cold water, using it as an excuse to thank Mason for his work. As I walked toward him, Mason looked up, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face before he accepted the glass from me. "Thanks," he said, his voice steady but with a faint tremor. I smiled in return, trying to keep the moment light and casual. "You must be tired working out here in the sun," I said, my gaze falling briefly on the swing he was fixing. "It's fine, I like doing this kind of work," Mason replied, his eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment. "It makes me feel at peace." The word peace echoed in my mind, as though he had unknowingly touched something deep within me. I glanced down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze any longer, afraid he might see the confusion in my eyes. "I hope you find that peace," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, we both stood there in silence, the only sound being the gentle rustling of the wind. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was taut, like an invisible string pulling us closer, tightening with every passing second. Mason set the glass down and straightened up, his presence so close that I could feel the weight of the air between us. "I should get back to work," Mason finally said, but his voice was hesitant, uncertain. I nodded, avoiding his eyes, and hurried back into the house, my heart pounding as though I had just escaped something dangerous. But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep running forever. That evening, as the rain poured down in heavy sheets, Mason stayed late to finish the job. David wasn't home, and in the emptiness of the house, I found myself inviting Mason inside after he had completed his work. I wasn't sure why I did it, perhaps I simply didn't want to be alone, or maybe my emotions had overpowered my better judgment. Mason stepped in, his clothes soaked from the rain, his damp hair sticking to his forehead. His eyes held a hint of surprise at my invitation. I handed him a towel and suggested he sit down for a moment to rest. He thanked me, and quietly took a seat on the chair opposite mine. The silence between us was heavier than ever, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. "I'm sorry if I'm intruding," Mason said finally, breaking the silence. "I can leave if you're uncomfortable." "No, it's fine," I replied, though my voice sounded hollow, like a lie we both recognized. He looked at me then, his eyes no longer guarded. "Claire, the last thing I want is to make things harder for you." I didn't know how to respond. His gaze pinned me in place and I realized I didn't want him to leave. I didn't want to ruin everything, but the intensity inside me was breaking through every boundary I had ever set. I leaned forward, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath, and I saw that he wasn't pulling away either. "We shouldn't do this," he said, his voice rough, trembling. But he didn't move. I couldn't recall what happened next, only that the distance between us disappeared in an uncontrollable instant. When our lips met, I felt the turmoil in both of us, the shared understanding that this was wrong, but that neither of us could stop it. Outside, the rain continued to fall, the rhythmic sound blending with the frantic pounding of my heart. I couldn't decipher my emotions. Desire, Fear and guilt all swirled together in an overwhelming storm. When we finally pulled away, Mason looked at me with an expression of anguish I couldn't bear. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. And before I could respond, he was gone. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed in the quiet, final and irrevocable. I sat alone in the darkness, acutely aware of the fracture within me. I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, that everything had shifted irreparably. But as I sat there, wrapped in my guilt and longing, I realized I didn't know how to escape the whirlwind of emotions I had unleashed, dragging me further into a chaos of my own making. The night after that encounter, everything between Mason and me changed irreparably. The air in the house, once heavy with my loneliness, was now filled with a different kind of silence. A silence weighed down by guilt, unease, and unspoken emotions. I tried to keep everything as normal as possible, convincing myself that what had happened was a momentary lapse, a mistake born out of fleeting weakness. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Mason no longer looked at me the way he used to. He kept his distance, avoided unnecessary interactions, and steered clear of situations that could put us in an awkward position. Yet, even without words, the tension lingered in every accidental glance, in every brief moment we crossed paths in the kitchen or the hallway. He was silent, but I could see in his eyes that he was battling himself, just as I was. I remember one evening vividly. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Mason walked in to grab a glass of water. Neither of us said a word. The only sounds were the soft trickle of water from the faucet and the faint clatter of the cutting board against the counter. But I felt his gaze linger on me, longer than it should have. I didn't turn to look at him, but I knew. I could feel the weight of his stare, and for a brief moment, it felt as though time had stopped. My heart raced, and I wanted to scream just to break the unbearable silence. Then, without a word, Mason turned and left. I stood there, staring at the knife in my hand, feeling like I was trapped in a labyrinth with no way out. David, meanwhile, remained oblivious. He continued to be the devoted husband he believed he was, providing for me, ensuring I had a comfortable life, occasionally surprising me with gifts to make up for his frequent absences. But he didn't see, or perhaps refused to see, that I was withering away in loneliness. And now, after what had happened with Mason, that loneliness had taken on a sharper, more painful edge. One afternoon, while David was out meeting clients, Mason and I were left alone in the house. I told myself I would avoid him, that I would maintain a safe distance. But when I walked into the living room and saw Mason sitting on the couch, staring out the window, I knew we couldn't keep avoiding each other forever. "Mason," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with conflict and sadness. "We need to talk." He didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at me for what felt like an eternity before nodding. I sat down across from him, the weight of the room pressing down on me like a vice. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words were caught in my throat. "I know what you're going to say," he finally said, breaking the silence, "and I know we can't keep going like this." I nodded, though the acknowledgement felt like a dagger to my chest. "You're right, we shouldn't. But Mason, I don't know how to stop feeling this way." He looked at me, his eyes soft yet filled with pain. "You don't have to explain. I understand. But I can't stay here anymore." His words cut through me like a blade. I knew he was right, that his staying here would only make things worse. But the thought of him leaving, of him being gone from my life, was unbearable. I couldn't muster a response. I just sat there, letting the pain wash over me like a storm I couldn't escape. In the days that followed, Mason began to avoid me entirely. He no longer joined me and David for meals, no longer lingered in the living room, and completely withdrew from the casual conversations we used to have. I felt abandoned all over again, this time by someone I had no right to rely on in the first place. I found myself doing irrational things, walking past places I knew Mason frequented, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. I felt ashamed of my emotions, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. I missed his smile, his gaze, and the way he made me feel alive, as though I truly mattered. One evening, while David was working late, I spotted Mason in the backyard, tinkering with the swing he'd been fixing. The dim light from the porch cast shadows over him, making him look almost ethereal, a statue carved with raw emotion. I stood there, frozen, unable to approach but equally unable to look away. Mason glanced up, noticing me, and neither of us said a word. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "This will only make things worse." I wanted to tell him he was right, that I would leave immediately. But instead, I found myself stepping closer, drawn to him as if by an invisible force I couldn't resist. When I stood before him, the space between us narrowed to mere inches. I could hear the unsteady rhythm of both our breaths. "Mason," I whispered. But before I could say anything more, he shook his head. "Don't," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, filled with torment. "We both know this isn't going anywhere." I didn't know how to respond. Tears welled up in my eyes and I turned away, walking back toward the house, leaving Mason alone in the darkness. But as I crossed the threshold, I knew that what we had done wasn't just a mistake. It had become an indelible part of me, something I could never erase. And I had no idea how to free myself from the chaos it had brought into my life. I sat silently in the living room, the soft yellow glow of the lamp failing to dispel the darkness weighing on my heart. After days of being torn between reason and emotion, I knew I couldn't continue like this. My relationship with Mason had crossed boundaries that should never have been touched. Even though my heart ached to hold on to him, my mind warned me that if I let this continue, I would lose everything. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't destroy my marriage with David, the man who had placed his unwavering trust in me, the man I had vowed to love and remain faithful to. And I couldn't hurt Mason any further, even though he now held a place in my heart that no one else could ever fill. But loving Mason was not an option. I had to end it all, even if it caused me a pain greater than anything I had ever known. That morning, as David left for an important meeting, I made the decision to call Mason. My voice trembled as I spoke to him over the phone, but Mason didn't ask any questions. He agreed to come without hesitation. I knew he too could sense the change in the air between us, a conclusion we both dreaded but knew was inevitable. When Mason stepped into the house, I could see the sadness in his eyes. He said nothing, sitting quietly on the chair across from me, as though waiting for what both of us already knew was coming. I took a deep breath, summoning the last of my courage to begin. "Mason," I said softly but firmly. "We need to talk." He nodded, his eyes fixed on me. "I know," he replied, his voice low but steady. "And I know you've already made your decision." His words cut through me like a knife. I wanted to deny it, to say I didn't want this, but the truth was, I had made my decision long before I called him here. I lowered my head, unable to meet his gaze any longer. "I'm sorry, Mason," I said, my voice cracking. "What's happened between us? It was a mistake I can't make again." He stayed silent, but I could see his hands clenching tightly on his knees, as if holding something back. "You don't have to apologize," he said. His voice calm yet heavy with sadness. "I understand, and I never wanted to hurt you or anyone." His words only broke my heart further. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I knew that would only deepen the pain for both of us. I lifted my head, trying to steady my voice. "Mason, you're an incredible person," I said sincerely. "But we can't keep going like this. I love David, and I can't lose him." He nodded, but his eyes betrayed the inner turmoil he was fighting. I don't want to cause you any more pain either. If this is what you want, I'll respect your decision. His response brought tears streaming down my face. I couldn't say anything else, only sat there as the weight of the moment crushed me. After a long pause, Mason stood. I think it's time for me to leave, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I didn't stop him, even though every fiber of my being screamed for me to make him stay. Instead, I stood up and walked him to the door. When it closed behind him, it felt like the entire world had collapsed. I leaned against it, tears pouring down my cheeks, my chest tight with pain and emptiness. That evening, when David returned, I forced myself to greet him with a smile. He wrapped me in a warm hug, oblivious to the storm inside me, as if nothing had changed. I looked at him, silently promising to do everything in my power to mend our relationship. Not out of guilt, but because I finally understood that true love lies in choice and commitment, not in fleeting moments of weakness. Over time, I began to find balance again. David and I spent more time together, working to rebuild the connection that had frayed over the years. We talked more, shared more, and made an effort to bridge the gaps that had grown between us. But the memories of Mason lingered, like a shadow I couldn't quite escape. There were nights when I would catch myself wondering where he was, if he ever thought of me, or if I was merely a brief chapter in his life. Even so, I knew I had made the right choice. Life was never meant to be perfect, and neither was love. But through my mistakes, I had learned how to love more deeply, how to hold on to what truly mattered, and how to avoid repeating the same errors. Mason had left, but he had also left behind a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life.